Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to find the perspective of objects that might on the surface be kind of difficult, right? It's very easy when you have a cube to find the perspective because the cube has very obvious lines, but something that's more flat might have less obvious lines, or something smaller, like say a pen. The example from one of my recent classes is a dagger, right? That might not be as obvious, but we're going to make it that much more obvious right now. So first things first, we talked about this with ovals or circles, or what do you call it? Ellipses, right? The closer it gets to the horizon line, the more you see either the top or the bottom, right? And we're just going to shade in a few squares here, or rectangles, and we're going to observe the different perspectives of those rectangles in different points on this 2-point perspective grid. Now, obviously, this could have been a 1-point perspective grid, this could have been a 3-point perspective grid, but usually when you see an item, it is in 2-point perspective, and the next most often will be 1-point perspective. 3-point perspective is extremely rare, right? So as we color in some of these, squares, I'll even do this big one here, right? You can see that just like, an oval or an ellipse, you see more of the top or more of the bottom as they get above and below the horizon line. And you can also see, even though these squares will have a completely flat side, right? Because we're not giving any dimension to them. We're not giving any side depth to them, right? But they still have a front face, right? It's just a very, very thin face. We're going to outline that right now. So just on a few of these. So if we look here, if I were to turn this one down here into more of a 3-dimensional shape, we can see how, depending on how much the object is turned, we see more of the front face, the side face, and the top face, right? Because essentially that's the difference between 1 and 2-point perspective, is you see more faces in 2-point perspective. So finding the dimension and the perspective of a square is how you can find the dimension or perspective of any flat item. And here I'm just highlighting the sides that we can see. So we think of the sides and we think of the face, right? So now, theoretically, so the great thing about this is because they're flat, right? When you have a shape like, again, a pen or a dagger, even a sheet of paper, they still have to be in perspective, but they're not as reliable as if, or as obvious, I shouldn't say as reliable, they're not as obvious as if you were to make them big 3-dimensional objects, right? Because now with the addition of these larger faces here, it becomes very easy. And if you were to put any of the aforementioned objects inside, you could put them inside like that. But since the object starts off so small, it's harder to see that larger cube around it, right? That larger brick around it. But that's not true if you look at the object on a square plane, like on a sheet of paper, as it will, right? Something with less dimension. So let's say we have our dagger. We're just going to draw daggers in the shape of just these little crosses, right? We don't have to do a detailed dagger for the purpose of this demonstration. In fact, we don't want to, because we can add details later. So you see here, the rule or the method is constructing and deconstructing, right? You construct things to build them up, and you deconstruct things to break them back down. And this process is how you learn how to draw things in proper structure. My students already know that, but I'm saying this for the sake of this video because this will be a public video. So that having been said, if I was to draw imaginary daggers just in the form of the T, and you see this T is actually very easy to do because we're literally just drawing this, we're just splitting the item, right? And we're using the sheet of paper, as it were, this flat rectangle, the same way we would use this more three-dimensional rectangle, right? And so now we can see how we can find an angle of something like a dagger if we were to reverse this process, right? If you look at these cross lines, the lines on the dagger are generally indicating perspective of some kind. And just like the ovals, and in the beginning of this example, these sheets of paper, the more you see the top of it, the more you know it's below the horizon line. And so this can be a little tricky in the sense that if you were to take a dagger, right, now let's just say I was gonna draw one real quick. All right, so, okay, we've got our dagger, right? And say this is the angle that your reference is at. Okay, cool. So if we look at this line here, and we look at that line here, and we draw the sheet around it, what we'll notice is we're seeing the front face of this sheet very prominently, right? We see this front face of the sheet, which means we're looking directly in front of it, which is the same thing as 1 point perspective, right? By seeing this entire face of this like that. So this would indicate that this is either in 1 point perspective or something, or a form of 2 point perspective that's very, very close to 1 point perspective, right? So let's look at another example of this. Let's say the dagger is more off to the side here, right? So we're gonna draw our T first, and we'll do the dagger like this. And these are just made up random shapes, right? I'm not doing this from reference or anything. Okay, and so let's say that's our reference, right? All right, well, we still have this T line, right down the middle here, going across this way. And we see, and I'm gonna go ahead and draw an imaginary. So this rectangle is purposefully inaccurate, right? I don't want an accurate rectangle. And walk you through the process of finding the perspective. So we see this line angling downwards, which means if we were to continue it, we know that the horizon line is going to be somewhere down here. And why is that? Because we can see the bottom of this face of this dagger. Even though it's thin, we can recognize we see the bottom. And if we really look at the dagger, if you imagine this is a little more arcing, we can kind of see this dagger arcing upward, right? And so even though the dagger is a relatively flat object, we can already start to approximate that perspective and also add in the fact, and I'll do this in red, look at the face that we can see of the dagger as well, right? You can see, if we were to color right on top of this front face here, you can say, oh, okay, well, this is the front face of the dagger. And so what does that mean? That means, again, you imagine the larger cube, the front face as well, right? And now it becomes a little easier to see the dagger inside of a sheet or, you know, a flat square, and to be able to turn that flat square into a 2 point perspective. So that's your key, is use the lines. And again, this works for anything that would be flat, right? So use the lines of the cross lines going down the middle and across the middle to indicate where this perspective might be. If the lines look like a straight up cross, like a crosshair, then that probably means that you're looking directly at it and you're in, you know, again, either a 1 point perspective or something very close to it. If the lines are, you know, angled, let's angle them a different way, right? So let's say it's angled like this, but you can very obviously see that this face of the dagger, this top face is showing, right? And this top face is showing. So now, since we can see the top of the dagger, we know that the horizon line is above, right? And if the dagger is, and so we talk about lines that are converging, right? If the blade of the dagger is wide here and then getting thinner there, and we can see the same action happening on the hilt, then we also know that those converging lines are a part of our picture as well, right? Which would put our dagger into a, I keep saying cube, but we really mean, brick rectangular shape, right? Three-dimensional rectangle. We know that the dagger could be in there, and then it still follows the same rules, right? Center point would be the middle point, and then that T would be inside of there, and it would follow the same rules of perspective that we've been talking about up until this point. So this is how you find the perspective of these flatter objects, these more difficult to find objects. You just want to relate them to either a sheet of paper first, and then additionally turn that sheet of paper, or think of that sheet of paper in a three-dimensional way to help you better place the object inside of, a perspective. And obviously it doesn't have to be that thick. I'm just doing that for the sake of the example. But yeah, so that'll help there, because even though a dagger is thin, it is still technically a three-dimensional object. There's one more thing I would like to illustrate here, is to think of a cylinder as well. Now the cylinder can still obey the same rules as the sheet of paper, and can even happen involved in the sheet of paper, but instead of turning this into a cube, you can just turn it into a cylinder. And again, this is more useful for something like a pen or what have you, but still, this is a great way to see the front and the sides of these smaller objects. And if you were to draw your dagger, let's zoom in here. If you were to draw your dagger inside of this cylinder, this cylindrical shape here, right? Erase that. And now we'll do the dagger inside of that. And we can keep the dagger really thin. I actually want to focus on these thinner shapes, because I think once the dagger gets thick enough, it becomes a little easier to see it. We're really talking about when the dagger is kind of thin and it's in an angle, you can't tell if it's coming forward, if it's coming backwards. Now hopefully you have some guidelines to make this a little easier to see. And always, if necessary, lean on those wireframe tactics to help you get an indication of what shapes that might be. All right, so hopefully that was helpful for finding perspective for some of these more difficult to approach objects. All right, see you in the next one.